masquerade, masks come off. Using the Unmasking Diary to explore the everyday process of neurodivergent autistic unmasking, author Natasha Stavros, PhD, speaks with licensed marriage and family therapist Sarah Liebman, diagnosed ADHD with special interests all things neurodiverse. Join us in this episode of Following the Threads as we explore social, psychological, and spiritual frameworks that empower resilience through change. As a reminder, this podcast is for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute counseling, psychotherapy, or mental health services. Listening to this podcast or communicating with the host and guests does not form a therapist-client relationship. The information here is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own mental health professional with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Welcome to Following the Threads. I'm Natasha Stavros.
And I'm Sarah Liebman.
Today's episode will be about the importance of self-study in preparation of getting an adult autism assessment. For those who have been listening, I recently got my diagnosis at a couple weeks shy of 39, and it took a while for me to get there. Not a crazy amount of time, but Sarah and I walk every morning, and you were the person who was like, oh, that's a little autistic. Oh, that's a little autistic. And I started to kind of just write things down, and I wanted to share today some of the things that I wrote down. So I wrote about emotional regulation challenges, feeling like when I'm in deep concentration and I become emotionally very dysregulated, if anyone were to interrupt that kind of intense focus.
The hyper-focus.
Yeah. And started learning about rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which we'll have a whole episode about.
Or three, yeah,
sure. And I started thinking about repetitive behaviors and sort of my obsessive compulsion that I have, some of which are like, I have to put everything away before I go to sleep. Like everything has a spot within a centimeter and everything gets put away before I go to sleep every single night. And my husband, Noah Smith, our amazing producer, is laughing because it drives him nuts.
And I would like to say that my family members, who may share some traits with all of us, they were your favorite guests ever because they put everything back except for one shelf in the fridge.
They did. It was amazing. Like that's probably one of my most dysregulating things is having I can't move. Yeah. I can't sleep. If I'm moving until everything is unpacked and has a space in a home, I can't.
Yeah.
So I thought that was repetitive behavior. And it turns out that it didn't actually qualify as per the DSM, what is it?
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
There you go. And, but one of the things that came up for me is that I recently realized while out on a date with my husband that I do have repetitive motion and behavior, and I shake my leg. Mm-hmm. And I have learned not to. And when I did my evaluation, I hadn't thought about that before. And so I didn't qualify because technically obsessive compulsion does not fall in the repetitive behavior sort of DSM criteria. And so let's see, what are some others? Unique abilities, social communication challenges. Great one there is like how my husband and I met online, and I came up with 70 criteria, and they had different point systems.
But the thing that's autistic about that is that they were useful, they were thoughtful, and you applied them. Someone else might come up with, so they're like me, a little more on the ADHD end of things, come up with it, and then go on the date and be like, oh, whatever. right? But like that's the thing that's so cool about you is like you when you come up with a system, you're like, and it can be really a creative one, like in a partner, right? But you use it, right?
Yeah.
And that's like the key to your success in a lot of parts of your life. But it's also different than how a lot of people
Right.
approach things.
Well, so writing down this list with
Yeah.
you, right? Like, and there were other ones around sensory too. Like, I started being like, oh, yeah, I really don't like gloves. I
Yeah.
really can't stand gloves. I would rather have bare naked hands in 0-degree weather than wear gloves
Yeah.
because I just can't stand to have anything around my fingers and feel constricted.
Yeah.
And so we started writing down this list. I go do my assessment. And as they're asking me questions, I think that I was better equipped to have that assessment because I had thought about these things in advance.
Yeah.
And I started creating a list. And there's a lot of things that you can do in this, but I think one of the things that we've talked about is last week we talked a lot about surrendering to a diagnosis as truth.
Mm-hmm.
Even before you get there, like, can you mentally prepare yourself for that truth? And I think today, thinking about it as self-study, right? Like that list, all those things, that's self-study.
Yeah.
And that helped me so that when I went in, I was able to communicate my experience.
Right. And the other thing is that, these were not, this wasn't new information, literally, like you always knew that you struggled with gloves, right? But it was that kind of just like tilting the frame a little bit and saying like, oh, this isn't just a me thing. And especially the intensity with which I feel this is not, maybe this is more. And so it took in, yes, there were new things that you'd never really thought about, but it also took in a lot of what you did know about yourself. And some of it was cast in the, this is bad, or I don't know why. And, and so it was, your reorganization of it, but don't have to be extremely organized to do that. But it's like things start moving around on a board. The puzzle pieces shift, things like that. So, and I mean, I think that the list also really reflected a lot of understanding of the social emotional difficulties that you were very aware of, but also like there was just this gap between all the work you put into it and what would happen, right? And so if we had been being really systematic about it, we could have gone and you could have handed it to him on a platter. Now, of course, that's not actually necessary. But, and for you, that was a big driving force, was that disconnect between your intentions and the amount of work you put into it and actually your need to collaborate and be on it, to create with other people, and the misses that were happening.
Right. So it's the shifting of the vantage point, right?
Yeah.
Because, and I think you and I have talked about this, is that very often people who are neurodivergent have probably spent a lot of time thinking about how different they are for
Yes.
some reason or another.
Yes.
Either because it's been something that has been messaged to them very heavily from the outside world, or it's just something that they've really internalized through their own sensations in their own body. And changing the vantage point can really help to shift your focus. So yes, you're introspective, right? Maybe you have been your whole life, right? But in the self-study, in the preparation, you're willing to, in that surrender to the diagnosis, like we talked about in the last episode, you are able to change your vantage point.
Right.
Understand.
It opens up a little more and there's a little bit more play in the structure. And so you can say, oh, maybe that is a sensory difference, not just I don't like gloves. Oh, yeah. Because before that, there's like areas of extreme tightness and extreme looseness.
Right.
And so it's really kind of like a, what is it like? It becomes tonic rather than hypo or hypertonic.
You're going to have to unpack that one for me.
Okay. Well, so when we talk about musculature, hypertonic is often like a very like the tone. So when we say muscle tone, it's tonicity. And so when,
so like the beach body.
Yeah. Well, no, because it has more to do with it's not strength. It's like, how are the muscles in the brain working together? Right. And so like a person who has cerebral palsy has hypertonic muscles because of the brain damage that's happened and then the patterns. Right. And somebody who has hypermobility because of being premature or because of a genetic predisposition to it, they have low muscle tone. So they tend to throw themselves at things or use a joint instead of the muscle tendon, all that stuff. And so, when we are, white knuckling in one way or another, psychologically, I was thinking about that as like, there are parts of us that are like, I'm just an anxious person, or I'm, and then over here, like this and this kind of like, with sort of less tone, it's like, there's something that I always seem to miss when
like
it
I'm
comes
flighty or
or like, in my diagnostic experience, realizing that like my daydreaming was not so much that I didn't care, but that like my inattentive part of my ADHD, if I wasn't engaged in it because I was struggling to understand things, I was looking out that window, and that wasn't just a bad habit. It was also it was indicative of something, right? So it had kind of been over here in this. Well, here's a bad part of me. I don't really know what to do with it. People don't like it. I missed a lot in third grade,
Yeah. So shifting this back to thinking a little bit about how this connects with what we talked about in our last episode around surrendering to the truth of, what that diagnosis would mean for you.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the trans-theoretical model and the transition from pre-contemplation to contemplation. And I think when we're talking about this in the context of self-study, it can also be sometimes not even looking at yourself, but looking almost outward at other people who maybe identify as ADHD or autistic or some other neurodivergence, and normalizing the neurodiversity that way, right? Like so that you can remove your judgment, so that you can actually show up and see that truth in yourself, looking at it from a different vantage point and not have judgment about it.
Yeah, right? Like that the self-study is, what is that? It's vicarious.
Vicarious reinforcement.
Yeah. And that allows, as one is developing this, kind of new standpoint for this vantage point, it is like, oh, wow. So if I think about how hard it is for me to get out of the house in the morning, and I don't think about myself as having just being bad or stupid or lazy, this person over here is like, they don't brush their teeth for 5 days in a row because it's so uncomfortable. Yeah, that's one of the things I avoid in the morning. I avoid brushing my teeth. Oh, like it's as if like the top comes off, but you don't have to be perceived and you don't have to tell anyone, but you start to see yourself in other people in a way that helps you to loosen up that perspective.
Yeah. And so we talked about this in the context of self-study. For me, I wrote a list and I started organizing my list. That's how my brain works. That's one way that I do it. Some other ways that you could do this would be having a conversation with a trusted person, and just reflecting on your past experiences and being open to the curiosity of that experience. Now, maybe you don't have that person in your life, or maybe you're uncomfortable doing that, so don't do it that way, right?
Yeah, but social media is another lovely way. You read the comments, you can watch it over again. I mean, it's one of the best things about social media is, having trusted unknowns, I guess would be a way to put it.
Right. And you could, on social media, you could look at whether, if you're thinking, okay, maybe it's autism, you could look at some autism influencers and follow their accounts. And you don't have to comment. You don't have to like. You don't have to do anything. You can just look at the content, look at the comments, and ask yourself, like, do I even identify with this?
Yeah, and it can just kind of, and one of the things that's so important about contemplation is this other word, moratorium, that comes from identity development. And it's kind of like you're making some tentative commitments and trying things out, but not committing. And that's very important when you're shifting from one thing to another, because you need to give yourself the space to let it sit, let it stick to something else, let it, kind of come together in your consciousness. Another thing that I thought, again, the internet is our friend. So, say you don't have a therapist who's kind of obsessed with neurodivergence like me, sometimes just looking at, online kind of, surveys, right? And we are not sponsored by Prosper Health, but they have really good surveys that you can take that are not, that kind of reflect their holistic way of assessing in adulthood. And they even talk about why they use this and that and the other thing. And sometimes the privacy to just take something in and think about it before you ever share it with anybody but yourself.
Right.
I know.
Right. And there's a lot of resources out there, right?
Yeah.
I've seen other groups. There's other trusted groups, Organization of Autism Research. This is Autism Awareness Month.
Yeah.
April is Autism Awareness Month, which is so ironic because it's also my birth month.
Yay!
So, I think one other thing we did talk about is you can work with a therapist.
Yeah.
So for me in particular, so I have alexithymia, and we'll talk about that also in in another episode. But the long and short of it for this episode is it's someone who really struggles to interact with their emotions. It doesn't mean that they don't have emotions. The emotions happen. They're happening in their body. They may even be able to cognitively identify somebody else's emotions, but they don't know how to interact with those emotions. They're almost happening on a different playing field. And so for me, self-examination, I'm almost like too outside of myself to actually know my own personal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like having a friend like you and being able to talk about this was so meaningful. Not everybody has a Sarah. I'm so sorry, but
well, we'll do what we can about that.
Yeah. Also, I found working with a therapist to be very helpful, and specifically a therapist who specializes in neurodivergent.
And in your particular case, again, not lovely. It would be lovely if you wanted to sponsor us, Prosper IO. But that the therapists, it's not just it's not generic. It's like kind of getting the diagnosis, understanding the diagnosis, shifting how you perceive yourself and how you set up your environment. So it's very valuable because, many people get an assessment and they're like, okay, great. Now what? How do I make this happen in my life?
Yeah. Yeah. And there are a lot of great resources on that.
Yeah.
And so we'll definitely link to those in the comment or in the body of the description. I do want to take a moment to just circle back on sort of some key takeaways for today. specifically around preparing to get an autism assessment from the viewpoint of self-study. First, I think it's that self-study is really important before you ever even go get an assessment, because the more you do the self-study, the more valuable the assessment is in the
And
end.
the more
informed the assessment can be is what I
the
mean.
more comfortable you feel going into it, because, right up until like the morning of it, the fear that like, I'm not going to be autistic, right? I'm going to just be told I'm just a crappy person is everybody's fear, but when you have kind of, you have at least the picture as, clear as it is to you, presented to the in the assessment, you're starting to really know yourself. In the new way. Mm-hmm. Or to know what you've known.
And this leads to sort of the second key takeaway, which is that that's really that, sort of revisiting that trans-theoretical model. That's that transition from pre-contemplative to contemplative. And then the last really key point that we want to hit on is that self-study plants the seeds of growing momentum to shift the perspectives from why am I bad to what's different. What happens when I look at things from a slightly different angle. Yeah. And specifically around the vantage point of a diagnosis, and doing that without shame and judgment.
And that, the thing that I think is really important from inside of the autism community is that self-diagnosis is valid. And that self-study is one of the ways that people often come to that. And there's a lot of reasons for not seeking, diagnosis from a psychologist. Some of that's money. Some of that is access. Some of that is I've already had enough bad experiences. But self-study is sort of like the yoke of that allows this to grow, because it holds all of that sort of nutrient.
It's the seed of the avocado.
It's the seed of the avocado. That's right.
All right. Well, with that, we'll say thank you all for joining us today on this episode of Following the Threads. Subscribe to the podcast to hear next week's episode, the third in the series on how to get ready to get an assessment. Please like, share, or comment. We look forward to getting to know you.
All right. See you next time.
This episode of Following the Threads is inspired by The Unmasking Diary, snippets from the book After the Masquerade, a memoir by Natasha Stavros. I first started on the path of getting a diagnosis slowly. My friend kept mentioning how certain things that I did aligned with autism. I started creating a list. Now, I would never just make a list. It had to be systematic. I started with a simple Google search, for which the AI reported that people with autism struggled with emotional regulation, repetitive behaviors, unique ability, social communication challenges, sensory sensitivity, learning differences, and special interests. My immediate reaction was to intellectualize how I may or may not fit into these categories. But through time, my list began to fill. I wrote down things as I organically discovered them. As my list of indicators grew, I wondered if I might actually qualify autistic. That's when the researcher in me turned on. My friend sent me the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, DSM, for autism specifically. As I reviewed it, I felt even more confused. By the letter of what was written, I wasn't sure if I qualified as autistic. After nearly 3 months, I decided to schedule an assessment. I felt very strongly that whether or not I was classified as autistic would be a coin toss. I was nervous about what the results might reveal, not because I feared a diagnosis, but I actually feared not getting a diagnosis. If I wasn't autistic, What could explain all of the challenges I had disproportionately faced compared to my peers? The evaluation is very matter of fact. It is nothing like therapy. It is important to articulate the distinction between these two activities. In therapy, I feel like a collaboration between me and the psychotherapist. In the evaluation, I felt like an object of study. Throughout the evaluation, the psychologist interviewed me against the DSM. They listened to me recall stories of my childhood and present life, used questionnaires from me, my dad, and my husband to translate my experience into the rigid structure of the DSM. I will say that while deeply uncomfortable, I felt safe through this process. When my evaluation came back qualifying me as autistic, and they read the evidence supporting a designation within each criteria, I noticed that the metrics cited were aligned with how much time I had spent thinking about my experience. When it came to repetitive behaviors and stimming, I didn't qualify. I had never given much active thought to how much I controlled my body to meet expectations. Fast forward nearly 6 weeks after diagnosis, I began to notice that maybe my original evaluation may not have been complete. My birthday's coming up, but we, my husband and I, couldn't get a babysitter for that weekend. Instead, we decided to have a date night early. I chose to go to a musical at a local dinner theater. It wasn't anything fancy. We live in Middle America, and it was a community theater, so tailor your expectations on skill level. But it was fun, entertaining, and it was just us. On the way to the event, we talked about my current processing of the diagnosis, what it means for me, my life, my job, and our family. I found myself getting preemptively defensive. He remained calm and engaged in the conversation. Upon getting to the event and being seated at our table, I began shaking my leg. Like a light bulb, I realized that I was stimming. I am deeply uncomfortable with emotional intimacy. I know that I need to do it, not just for my husband, but because it's human nature to need connection. Knowing that and actually engaging with emotional intimacy are two entirely different things. As I sat there becoming more conscious of the involuntary movement in my leg, I noticed a chill pass over me. I asked my husband for his jacket and immediately used it to cover myself. I knew that my desire to wear a down jacket 24/7 fit somewhere in the diagnostic criteria, but I hadn't really ever tapped into the circumstances or my internal experience that resulted in me feeling comfort from the coat. I assumed it had to do with sensory stimulus, but I hadn't identified it as protection from engaging with my emotions. It's not that I don't have emotions. Quite the opposite. My emotions are big and intense, and when I engage with them, bad things happen. This text is a snippet from my next book, After the Masquerade. For early access to the book and other resources, upgrade to a paid subscription via Substack at natashastavros.substack.com. Thanks for joining us today on this episode of Following the Threads. I'm Natasha Stavros, co-host and executive producer, here with Sarah Liebman, co-host, Linda Highfield, director, and Noah Smith, audio engineer and composer.